With the London Naval Treaty leaving the Royal Navy with a total displacement figure for the newly defined light cruiser, the Admiralty found itself with a problem. Even with almost 200,000 tons of displacement allowed, plus 15 heavy cruisers, there was no way all the British commitments could be covered. Ideally, they wanted around 70 cruisers for this. Even just over 50 would mean that massive areas of the ocean would be exposed by a war that drew resources into a specific theatre, but to build full-size 10,000-ton ships would leave the Royal Navy with not even 3 dozen cruisers. Even just churning out more Leanders would give them just over 40 hulls if you assumed that the older C, D and E classes would eventually be decommissioned. And so the search was on for an even smaller design. It was immediately acknowledged that going to less than the Leander's 8-gun armament would leave the ships capable of really only fighting legacy vessels like the Tenryu or Nagara classes, as well as destroyers and commerce raiders. The new 10,000-ton heavy cruisers and the 10,000-ton light cruisers that were sure to come would be entirely out of this ship's league. But a smaller ship could be built in greater numbers and could at least take on the job of guarding the trade routes, which would leave the larger Royal Navy cruisers to head off for the main battle line. Just in case they were needed on the front lines, though, these ships would need to retain full cruiser speed, since the enemy might send their older cruisers to beef up their own numbers, and these ships might need to counter them, and any modern cruiser should provide a good backstop to destroyer flotillas. Thus, taking the Leanders as a basis, the super-firing aft turret, X-turret, was deleted, and the resultant empty space was also removed, thus shortening the ship and saving weight. The ships were also about 5 foot narrower on the beam, which would remove a single torpedo tube from each launcher. Thus, the ship's armaments consisted of half a dozen 6-inch guns in 3 twin turrets, 2 super-firing forward and the one aforementioned aft. Initially, anti-aircraft protection came courtesy of 4 single 4-inch guns, although this was replaced midway through production by 4 twin dual-purpose 4-inch mounts. A pair of quad 50 cal machine guns and 2 triple torpedo launchers, one per side as opposed to the quads on the Leanders, completed the as-built armament. Speed remained at about 32.5 knots, courtesy of 64,000 shaft horsepower, delivered via 4 screws on a standard displacement of about 5,250 tons, plus or minus a little bit depending on if the ships had the single or the twin 4-inch. Armour consisted of 3-inch maximum thickness over the magazines and just 1 inch on the turrets. A seaplane was also carried for scouting purposes. 6 vessels were planned in the initial production run, of which 4, Arethusa, Galatea, Penelope and Aurora, were built, with the Minotaur and Polyphemus ending up being ordered as town-class cruisers, although those 2 particular names ended up being kicked down the road through multiple classes. The reordered vessels ended up becoming Newcastle and Southampton in the end. As the war progressed, all ships would standardise on the 4 twin 4-inch AA mounts, with additional armour plate being added between the box magazines, similar in scope although smaller in scale to the refits that the county-class heavy cruisers had. And a wide variety of radar and smaller anti-aircraft weapons were also added. Unrotated projectile launchers made a brief appearance early in the war before disappearing almost as fast, whilst quadruple pom-poms were a more permanent feature alongside a number of 20mm Oerlikons, all of this being supplemented or replaced later in the war by 40mm Bofors depending on the ship. As it turned out, all 4 ships ended up on the front lines. Galatea was the first to be lost, torpedoed by U-557 in the Mediterranean at the end of 1941, by which point she'd picked up a pair of quad pom-poms and 8 single 20mm Oerlikons. HMS Penelope became famous during her service in the Mediterranean as HMS Pepperpot, a nickname acquired whilst under repair in Malta in summer 1942, when numerous near misses from Axis air attacks turned her into a heavily armed sieve. She was then dubbed HMS Porcupine when all of the hulls were plugged with wood fragments, as there was no point in replacing most of the outer hull plating while she was still in Malta. She also had the neat distinction of having her anti-aircraft gun barrels replaced on entry into dry dock, only to have worn them out defending herself and Malta while she was there and needing them to be replaced again before she left. Despite 4.5 years of the Luftwaffe's best efforts, her fate would come courtesy of the Kriegsmarine, as she was sunk in February 1944 by U-410 whilst on her way back to the Anzio landings. Arethusa survived the war, although not for lack of trying by the Axis, with the ship being torpedoed and mined on separate occasions, as well as suffering numerous near misses from bombs. She was eventually sold for scrap in 1950. Aurora also survived the war, like her sisters, seeing lively service in the Mediterranean, including being hit by a bomb at least once, although her crew were somewhat better informed than most others as to what was going on around them, as the actor Kenneth More had signed up for the Navy at the outbreak of the war and had ended up assigned to the Aurora. With nothing much better to do whilst the ship was under attack but was yet to be damaged, he took to using the PA system to narrate the action to his shipmates locked in the bowels of the vessel. Aurora was then sold to the Nationalist Chinese forces in 1948, becoming the Chung King. But in 1949 the crew defected to the Communist Chinese, whereupon it seems the People's Republic of China couldn't quite decide what to call the ship after nationalist aircraft sank her in harbour and she was salvaged. In the subsequent 2 decades she was first the Chong King, which is just spelt slightly differently, then the Huang Hui, then the Pai Ching, and finally the Guang Shou, most of which are horribly mispronounced in all likelihood, before finally being scrapped at some point in the late 1960s.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.